I just want to thank everybody for having me here today. Thanks to Wendy and Paul and everybody for organizing such an interesting event. Privileged to be part of such an outstanding group of presenters today. What I'd like to do is start to provoke you to think of leisure, or I guess I should say leisure. This is my North American leisure thing. Families and aging, and in terms of digital technology and everyday lives. When I first met Wendy in ACT, I was super excited because there was another person looking at what people do in their everyday lives, and I thought, well, there's leisure. But I do just need to sort of premise that with an understanding that leisure, just like technology, is not necessarily a universal good, as it's often portrayed. It's a subjective experience. It's self-determined, intrinsically motivated, hopefully fun, all of those things. But it does often get taken up in a very normative way to promote those discourses of healthy and active aging, which we know can be highly problematic. And so I acknowledge that certainly there are benefits to leisure, but like Barbara, approach my work again knowing that older people are a very diverse group of people and have very diverse experiences as we move through. So, am I gonna go in the right direction? There, how about that? Good? Oh, no, that went too far too again. There we go. Okay, so little, although a growing body of work is starting to explore technology and aging, but less work has focused on the social participation of older people and how that impacts their family relationships. And so this work that I've been doing and what I'm going to talk about today explores the variegated experiences of women who are aging in a digital world. And so the objective is to explore the digitally mediated experiences of grandmothers, in particular, their relationships with their children and their grandchildren. And specifically, this particular study that I'm referring to looks at a whole range of information and communication technologies, ICTs, computers, tablets, smartphones, and also different platforms. So Skype, FaceTime, Facebook, texting, email, all sorts of different things. And so this work is supported by ACT, which I'm very pleased and privileged to be part of, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Just quick little background here. In much of the work, like I said, around leisure, older adults are rendered invisible or at best more passive users, which is a term I also struggle with. And as Barb pointed out, much of the research focuses on those assistive technologies, less so in that social and communication realm. There isn't a lot of specific understanding of grandmothers' experiences in the context of families. And then we also know Lundby talks about mediatization, which is this meta kind of global process whereby everyday practices and social relations become shaped and are shaped by these mediating technologies and organizations. Why was I interested in grandmothers? Particularly because still grandmothers are more responsible for facilitating family relations and family communication, and probably because I had really interesting relationships with my own grandmothers. So, and what we have learned from the bit of work that we have done is that ICTs often provide an important incentive for grandparents to engage with social media in order to engage with those family members. And so today, not that there aren't other important variables to consider, but today I want to kind of focus on these intersections of age, gender, and their family status, family relationships. So, some of the things that older adults are bombarded with, you know, and I mean, I'm not on Facebook, but apparently they come across Facebook quite often and quite regularly. So, situated broadly within critical theory, the work here today is really going to be to interrogate these very ageist assumptions related to leisure and digital media use or non-use. I think that's important to consider as well. And rather than assuming that older adults are incapable of learning and engaging with new technologies, I explore how grandmothers are agentic in their choices around media use and their family relationships. And so by exploring that mediatization of these relationships, the research, I hope, broadens our understanding of digital technology in family relationships to explore those intersections I noted earlier. And last, silly cartoon, but as Barb has mentioned, much of the work around technology is focused on these assistive technologies and devices. So we're gonna leave that all behind and we're gonna look at the social communication piece. So despite those ageist assumptions, our research clearly indicates that grandmothers' use of ICTs is very diverse. Well, all of them who we have talked to are using them, but that's been a criteria for inclusion in the study. But they are using them, but they're using them in all sorts of different ways and all sorts of different amounts and things like that. And really important is that they experience both opportunities and challenges in the context of these relationships. So today I'm going to discuss this with attention to a couple of key themes around grandmothers' ambivalence about the role of ICTs in their families, as well as grandmothers' agencies in their engagement with ICTs. So this draws on work that we've done over the past 3 years as part of a 7-country comparative study focusing on Canada, Romania, Israel, Peru, Spain, Italy, and Colombia. So a fairly diverse geographical, cultural representation. And we've done 4 focus groups in each of those countries, rounding out to conversations with close to 200 different grandmothers about how they use, what they do, with whom, how they experience it, and all sorts of questions like that. And we've asked them specifically about that in the context of their families, with their friends, and then in their own individual leisure experiences. So, the impact or the importance in family relationships. So, family relationships, as we said, are an important motivator for grandmothers to engage with ICTs. It's not the only reason they go online, but it is consistently cited as one of the most important reasons and benefit for doing that. But this is, as you can see illustrated in this quote, it's a complex and a contradictory experience. And so here we see the issue of global migration, transnational families, or even within Canada. Like, I live in one province, my parents are in the next province, but that's an 8-hour drive away. So it's a huge country compared to you guys hopping over to Paris for the day or something like that. If you ever do that. I don't know if you do that or not. But also, a salesperson in a store yesterday told me she just does that. So that's where there's where I'm getting my data. But also the importance of, quote unquote, having a face. These video chat, Skype, FaceTime, those sorts of things are very important in having the grandchildren, when they're young, but even as they age, be able to recognize Granny and Grandpa in the process and build a relationship with them. And very much in this everyday life context. One grandmother talked to me about we sat for an hour and a half and watched this kid eat peas, but it was the highlight of their day. They would read books with their kids over Skype. They would play hide and seek together. So there's all sorts of ways that they use these technologies. But that also they're agentic and very purposeful or intentional in their leisure engagement, so that they use these very intentionally to help to facilitate family relationships, family communication, and family bonding. So, but consequently, these relationships then become mediatized. But how do they use it and how do they experience it? So family scholars Cherlin and Furstenberg over 30 years ago talked about this norm of non-interference and it has become really one of the most widely held, certainly within the North American context in particular, but the widely held social norms related to grandparents and their involvement, that they're expected to be involved, but not to be meddling or interfering or being a burden in how they do that. And so they wrestle with this contradiction, and they want to be highly involved. They don't necessarily want to babysit all the time, okay? So here's where some of the conflict and intergenerational challenges come. They want to be involved, but they don't want to be overbearing. They don't want to be perceived as interfering. And so what they do with technology is they work to really exercise some of their agency in that family relationship through technology. So here, this grandmother talks about texting with her son so that she's not bothering him with a phone call. He doesn't have to answer right then. He can get back when it's convenient for him. But also things like, I'm just blanking on the other example of things. Of using Facebook to view pictures and stay up to date that the parents post of the grandchildren. So every day they can check and check and check and see what's going on without having to pick up the phone and be nagging. This is the language that's used in the media, be nagging and interfering. So they use Facebook in this way to view things, which sometimes, again, we term as passive use, right? They're not active users, they're not commenting or posting as much, some certainly do, but they often are viewing just to stay up to date with what's happening. So, but what does that kind of mean to them? And they use this opportunity again as a way to sort of teach and model other social norms related to decency and privacy. I'm a conspiracy theorist, I don't do social media. I expected lots of conversations about privacy and concerns around that. It certainly came up, but not nearly as much as if I had been a participant in the study myself. Nonetheless, lots of comments like this. My son posts stuff on Facebook that I don't think he should, right? And so then they have to navigate these conflicts and contradictions in the relationship to say, don't post those pictures of me. So many grandmothers said people come up to them in the grocery store and say, oh, your granddaughter's playing soccer. And she says, how on earth did you know that? It was quite intrusive. And so they have these norms, not as some around privacy, but also around decency. And they use this opportunity to sort of model more for their grandchildren, but some for their children, about how much information do you really need to disclose about yourself online. I had another grandmother who talked about, she used the analogy of, it would be like if I printed off a whole bunch of pictures of myself, stuck them on my car, and drove around town. Like, that would be considered to be absurd. So they're really trying to sort of navigate this technology, some of that in terms of good, some of that in terms of challenges, but they're very aware of these norms and these labels, right? Many of them called themselves lurkers, right? And so they're very aware of the terminology and these social norms around their use, but they're critical about that, right? They're saying, well, I'm called a lurker, but it's their way of engaging and staying in touch. So since I'm not at my time yet, let me just grab a quick. So the kind of, one of my big interests is in this, that's my time zone leg, has been around this idea of ambivalence in families and family relationships. And this, this is a quote, comes here, but the number of times I hear this in the study, it's a blessing and a curse. And I think many of us would say that about technology. I don't think this is completely unique to older people, but it is certainly how they experience these technologies, and in particular these technologies in terms of their relationships with their families. And so I think it's important to distinguish that when we talk about ambivalence and intergenerational ambivalence, we're not talking about, quote unquote, I don't care. That's not what ambivalent means. Ambivalence was proposed as intergenerational ambivalence by Kurt Luescher and Karl Pillemer in terms of having coexisting, contradictory thoughts, feelings, emotions that are irreconcilable, that there is conflict and there is consensus, and they happen simultaneously. It's just part of the experience, okay? So they come from not just internally, like there's psychological ambivalence in an internal way of how we feel and experience these things, but also in terms of sociological ambivalence, whereby the struggle is around these competing demands or role expectations, where they have these competing and contradictory experiences. So to be involved, but to have some challenges with being involved. And so the grandparents, grandmothers here were certainly ambivalent about how they experienced digital technology. They had lots of stories of things that they loved about technology. One thing that I hadn't necessarily expected, but they all talked about and brought up on their own were maps and GPS in the car and the backup cameras. Like Kim mentioned, different kinds of technologies that we're not necessarily thinking about. Those were helpful, but at the same time, still caused some conflict, right? How many times do you ride in the car and your partner's all about the GPS and you know you're going the wrong way, but they won't listen to you because they're following the computer? Nobody's ever had that experience? I have it a lot. So they talked about that, about yelling at each other in the car about where they're supposed to go. But they valued that. They loved YouTube for finding recipes for baking and cooking, and they engaged in intergenerational relationships that way, teaching their grandchildren how to bake, passing on those family recipes, that sense of leaving a legacy, a bit related to that sense of generativity. That it allowed them to be more connected with their families, either through texting, through email, through social media, Facebook, or the video chats. We had one, this is one of my most interesting stories from the Canadian grandmothers. One grandmother was downloading images from the Hubble telescope to her computer, printing them out on a fabric printer, so that she could quilt a quilt for her grandson who loved astronomy. Like, I couldn't even begin to start to know how I would do that. So our ageist assumptions around technology are problematic, but there was the whole range of people. There were people who had a smartphone only because their children had given it to them, and they used it primarily for texting. They had started to use email. They used technologies for different things as well, right? Many of the, particularly within the Canadian sample, most of these women had engaged with computers, at least, in their work lives already. They ranged in age from about 60 to 89, so we had a full range, probably not the, I'll get Paul's question before he even gets to it. Not the fourth agers, maybe, but getting there, some of them. So, but there were all sorts of different challenges, and they said they would communicate that way. Yes, we would text or we would email, but again, the repeated quote that came up was, but when I really want to talk to them, I just pick up the phone, right? The telephone, having a conversation, couldn't be replaced by these other technologies. And then the last couple of things that they talked about in terms of some of the challenges, so lots of things they appreciated, but lots of challenges. Cost is a huge challenge, and particularly in the Canadian context, we have, and we've got our policy experts in the room, we have some of the highest telecom costs of anywhere in the world. So they couldn't necessarily afford the devices or the plans in order to be able to use them. It is a large country, and it has we have lots of urban centers, but also a lot of rural centers where connectivity is a problem. The access is still on dial-up or things like that. So how do you navigate all these new websites when the hamster's spinning in the computer trying to connect to the internet? Keeping updated was the bane of everybody's existence. They said, I just get it figured out, and then the company changes it and they update something. So that ability to stay capable as users of the technology was challenging for them. And then, as always, there are challenges related to vision and the size of things, tactile engagement with things, hearing, all those sorts of things that the developers aren't still yet very good at considering. So, to conclude, and I think I'm going along okay with my time. I'm used to 15 minutes, not 30 minutes, so that's awesome. I think to conclude, what I would like to leave you with today is that grandmothers' experience of technology in their everyday lives is certainly multifaceted, it's complex, and it's contradictory. And their relationship with this technology is, to me, clearly an ambivalent one that holds great promise, great opportunity, but also great cost and great potential for exclusion. And so they are sometimes struggling, but just sometimes engaged really with negotiating these multiple, often competing social norms, ideas around non-interference, around decency and privacy, around active aging, and this techno-optimism that Barb mentioned. There's so much emphasis for them on not being a burden to their families and to use technology to quote-unquote battle or fight against age and aging. And so we need to do a better job of attending to older adults in particular, and how older adults both experience and resist technologies. I think we have much to learn from this process. And to just sort of finish with, I was at the Tate Modern yesterday, and you'll have to correct me if I get the name wrong, but there was a digital exhibit there with a quote from a British artist, Tacita Dean. Would that be her name? Anybody? Thank you. Awesome. And she was talking about it in terms of art and where we're going with the digital, but I thought it was quite apt for our conversation today, where she said, digital is not better than analog, but different. What we're asking for is coexistence, for the ascendancy of one not to have to mean the extinguishing of the other. Thanks.
Thank you.